In the previous lesson, what we did was examine the fundamental rationales behind the law of tort, specifically elucidating the principle of compensation, talking about how compensation is a fundamental principle within tort more generally. In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the types of tort which exist, and in so doing, we're going to be examining the different protected interests that exist within the law of tort as well. So, essentially, the types of torts which exist and the types of torts that we are going to be examining relate to the types of interests which may be protected by the law of tort, by a particular tort in question. So, as you will probably know, what this series of lessons is going to entail is a series of lessons covering a substantive amount of the law of tort. We're going to be talking a lot about negligence, we're going to be talking about occupier's liability, product liability, vicarious liability, defamation, nuisance, the rule of Rylands and Fletcher, the various intentional torts such as trespass. And so as a result of this, you can see that tort is not a single unified area of law per se. It is more of a subsection of various different types of torts which exist. Okay, you can study negligence, and then you can study occupier's liability, and then defamation. They all have a common thread running through them, and this common thread is elucidated in the fundamental rationales of tort. The idea that a tort is a wrong which is committed or which is performed in a way, and that wrong ought to be compensated by some kind of damages towards the claimant. So, given the fact that we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the various different kinds of torts, I thought it'd be useful to have a look at the various types of harms that exist and the various kinds of interests which are subject to the protection within the law of tort. Now, the most fundamental and foundational of these protected interests is that of personal injury. So, the most common is, of course, the fact that you are protected in terms of injury claims and in terms of personal injury claims. This is done through mainly the tort of negligence. Negligence will protect an individual against unjust harms which are caused onto them. Negligence is also by far the most litigated of all of the torts, and we're going to get into negligence beginning in the next lesson, and we will go through and examine them in far more detail. But essentially, what the law of negligence did was begin its life around the 1800s and was something of a relatively insignificant tort which existed. And we will see the development and the expansion in scope of negligence when we look at some fundamental and foundational cases, specifically pertaining to the duty of care and the way in which the duty of care is applicable outside of, for example, a contractual obligation. This, of course, brings us to the case of Donahue and Stevenson, arguably the most famous case in all of English law, owing partially to the facts of the case being particularly memorable, or particularly memorable, if I'm going to use the English language, and so as a result of which we will get to this in future lessons' time. But personal injury and negligence doesn't necessarily just include physical injury. You also have individuals who are able to make claims for psychiatric injury. Now, this is a particularly difficult area of tort because psychiatric injury does open the door to litigation, and certain judges and commentaries on the law of tort, specifically on the tort of negligence, have made the argument that psychiatric injury can actually open the door, or could have potentially opened the door to potentially imaginary claims. Now, the reason why this is not necessarily the case anymore, or was never necessarily the case, is because psychiatric injury is very heavily limited in the law of tort. There are very many restrictions on who may and may not be able to make a claim within negligence for psychiatric injury. You have to have a certain, there has to be certain recognized psychiatric conditions that are ascribed onto you. You have to also make delineations between the kind of psychiatric victim you may be, i.e. a primary or a secondary victim. We'll get to all this in future lessons' time, but just note that psychiatric injury claims are particularly limited. But they still exist, and they can still exist, and it therefore means that when we talk about personal injury, we are not necessarily just focusing on the idea of physical injury. We also think about psychiatric injury as well. Another protected interest within the law of torts is the protection of your reputation. So, the tort of defamation is the tort which protects an individual from the reputation, protects their reputation from false claims. Essentially, if an individual decides to make public untrue statements about an individual, which may be harmful to one's reputation, then this can cause them to be liable for either slander or libel. Now, the whether or not it's slander or libel depends on the medium by which you actually make those untrue statements, but they both fall under the general umbrella banner of defamation. So one of the things that is important to note here is that the protected interest of reputation is a public interest. So it is something that is protecting public untruth. So an individual cannot claim things to be said in private, which would make no difference to a person's reputation. So if I make a private accusation towards an individual, they can't then sue me for defamation. It is only when those are made public, and this is obviously something which can cause reputational harm, that we can then start to think about how defamation protects that individual. What about harm to property? There are various different torts which we can see in this regard. The protection of property is broad and very all-encompassing. You can have, for example, the protection of an individual's realty, i.e. real property or land. For those who are studying land law as well, we have lessons on land law that we are doing at the same time, running in conjunction with this series. We will note that there is a distinction that is made often between real property and personal property. The main delineation here is a delineation on the basis of whether or not third parties can be bound to the particular interest in that property. So realty and land is something that has the ability for individuals to have third party binding towards them. And so the protection of property can include this idea of real property, real estate, land, for example, and also the protection of personal property. We can see personal property being protected by a number of what are known as trespass torts, so such as trespass to land and trespass to goods. You also have the tort of conversion, which we're not going to get into in too much detail in this series, but we'll get into in a series of lessons when we look at personal property law. Trespass to land and the rule of Rylance and Fletcher may be able to protect an individual's right over realty, over real property, over land itself. And so you can see here various different torts which protect various different interests in property. Finally then, what about financial interests? What financial protection? What is quite interesting in this regard is that the law of tort offers relatively limited protection to an individual's financial interests. So, for example, the general rule in negligence for pure economic loss is that there is no claim to be had. There are various exceptions to this, which we will get to, but it's quite interesting that there may be some economic protection in the case of negligence, but there is also other torts which can have an impact on an individual's financial position. But for the most part, individual torts, such as the tort of deceit, will protect an individual from financial, or protect an individual's financial interests within the law of tort. Again, we'll get to all of this in future lessons' time, but for the most part, when we talk about financial interests, they are often attached to other interests that exist. So you'll find the protection of your financial interest may be attached to your protection of your physical protection from physical or personal injury, or even reputational harm, for example. And so as a result of which, financial protection sort of is a thread that runs through many of the torts which we will be examining in more detail.